Hi, I'm Bergen Eickhoff, and this is Sunday School Round 2. Today we're beginning our Women of Christianity video series with a focus on Aimee Semple McPherson, who you either know too well or not at all depending on what kind of church you grew up in. Either way, let's start with an illustration. It's New Year's Day in 1937 and you're in one of the 5,300 opera seats of the Angelus Temple. On the gigantic front stage, a man dressed up as the Pharaoh of Egypt from the Exodus story struts onto the stage. He rises in power before being struck down by the power of God. Following him are flamboyant portrayals of the King of Babylon, King Herod, Attila the Hun, Napoleon, Nicholas II, Kaiser Wilhelm, and King Edward VIII. Bands, drill teams, and musicians appear on stage to portray their rise to power only to be defeated by God. Next, the villain Charles Darwin appears on stage, and as actors portray his life, Aimee Semple McPherson, the true star of the show, explains how his theory of evolution, while debunked, has promoted atheism all around the world. After Darwin came extravagant performances of Vladimir Lenin, Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler, who were all defeated by God for a time and fade into the background. But then Uncle Sam emerges onto the stage, rising upon a pure foundation of pilgrim origins and a Christian legacy from the Founding Fathers throughout its 150-year life. But now McPherson explains, as shadowy figures surround Uncle Sam, that the dangers of secularization, cooperation with European nations, the teaching of evolution, anarchy among workers, and the removal of Bible from public schools all threatened to destroy God's chosen nation. It was only Jesus, McPherson declared, who left a legacy that endured. This March of the Monarchs showed that unless America holds to its faith in Jesus, it would surely fail. And this is the legacy of Aimee Semple McPherson. Spectacular depictions of a simple, fundamentalist American gospel that turned Hollywood modernism and production into a preaching device. She is at once an icon of women's unique call to preach in defiance of patriarchal norms and a cautionary tale of how prioritizing spectacle over substance can bring out the dangers of Christianity. Today, we are learning about the life of the Foursquare Preacher, Aimee Semple McPherson. So for those of you who don't know, I'm queer. I'm bisexual and non-binary, which means that my identity and expression and way of relating to the world doesn't fit neatly into the clean categorization of American capitalism and Christianity. Actually, it means a lot more than that, but that's for another video. This era of history is probably the best time for queer folks like me to be alive, which is seriously saying something. And America is definitely one of the more tolerant places in the world for non-heterosexual sexualities and for trans and gender non-conforming people, which again is saying something. And yet, while tolerance is present, acceptance is rare, and acceptance is even more rare within Christianity. The Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which I belong to, is willing to let me preach and lead congregations, but certainly not every congregation in the ELCA is willing to call a queer pastor or deacon or even permit a queer couple to be members or get married, even queer single people. To plenty of people in my denomination, my religion, and my country, I don't have the right to preach. My life and my voice are not considered legitimate witnesses to the gospel, and sometimes I and other queer people like me are threatened because of our identity, particularly within Christianity. So how have queer people responded to this prejudice, intolerance, and even aggression as they've worked to gain acceptance in the church over the past 50 years? By rejecting conformity and embracing the difference of our witness to the gospel. Flamboyance, camp, drag, and performance are how many queer ministry leaders have forced American Christianity to listen to their message even when Christianity has done its best to ignore them. And by embracing a different method of church through performance and dramatics, queer Christian leaders have revealed that there is a significant desire for their dynamic, non-traditional expression of Christianity. And that is what fascinates me about Aimee Semple McPherson. Even though her gospel would want nothing to do with queerness, her life and ministry mirror and anticipate the modern project of many queer Christians. Now let's begin diving into her life. Aimee Semple McPherson was born in 1890 in a rural Canadian town to a Methodist minister and a mother involved in the Salvation Army. She was intelligent and well-read and soon identified evolution as the main opponent to Christianity, first because of its challenge to biblical authority, but after seeking help from pastors who failed to debunk evolution's claims, she grew disillusioned with mainline Protestant Christianity, seeing it as stuffy, intellectual, and useless as a guide for life. Her faith was revitalized after she witnessed Robert Semple preach at a Pentecostal revival and became enamored with the simple and direct gospel message of Pentecostalism, of giving oneself over to Jesus' grace to overcome the world's evil. She also became enamored with Robert Semple and married him soon afterwards. Sadly, he died 2 years into their marriage on a trip to China. And in the aftermath of his death, Aimee struggled with a burgeoning call to preach. On the whole, women preachers, even in the loose structure of Pentecostalism, were rare and frowned upon at best and condemned at worst. Yet through her reflections upon reading the Bible with Robert, she finally determined that being a woman was no longer an excuse to deny her prophetic calling. So Aimee began preaching across the United States on a tour while writing the Bridal Call magazine on women's roles in Christianity. And she soon became renowned for her faith healing demonstrations. Newspapers in the Northeast United States would send reporters to follow up on her healing services after overwhelming numbers of people claimed to be immediately healed by her preaching and prayer. After a particularly prominent display in Baltimore, Aimee achieved national renown and began raising money to build a temple in Los Angeles, which had become the site of her ambition to bring Christianity to the modern world. Now, why Los Angeles? To answer that, we need to dive into the social context of Aimee's life. The majority of Aimee Semple McPherson's ministry took place during the time between World War I and World War II, and a lot happened in those years. One major theme was the rise and fall of the Jazz Age, the post-war economic boom of America, which saw the rise of new wealth, a massive social life, gender redefinitions, increased secularism and sexuality, bootlegging, and a new film industry like nothing before, all centered in Hollywood, California. In short, a lot of people suddenly had access to a lot more money and wanted to spend it on glamour and fame. This would all change after the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression, where an impoverished nation and an exhausted one would crave a reason to believe in America's greatness once again. America witnessed a growing divide between modernists and fundamentalists. Modernists, mostly mainline Protestants, were those who believed in scholarship, biblical criticism, and the compatibility of science and faith, also traditional models of church organization and authority. Fundamentalists, on the other hand, primarily Baptists and Pentecostals, believed in the pure infallibility of the Bible and Christianity's superiority over any other form of knowledge, which led towards more charismatic modes of church organization and leadership. In the 1920s, Hollywood created the image of the new woman, which is most famously embodied by the flapper. Short dresses, long bare legs, short hair, lots of makeup. And while women's sexuality was somewhat more accepted as a result, sexism was still really strong. Women were expected to not work, much less preach or lead in any context, and in the Depression it became worse. The thought was that if a woman was working, then she was taking away a job from a man who needed it more, which doesn't make any sense, but, well, there it is. And it's worth mentioning here that Aimee Semple McPherson faced a ton of criticism for her entire career, both for being too sexual and for being not sexual enough. Some of the most vicious criticism of her appearance as a preacher came from mainline Protestants, who reasoned that her identity as a woman, especially a woman who dressed sexually, made her preaching anathema. It's a good thing that we've solved sexism and women in ministry today never receive any horribly sexist comments. The final context to bring up is Hollywood. America's mind was in the process of being blown each year as directors and actors and cinematographers found new ways to bring stories to life on the silver screen. From all the money flowing into the film industry came new celebrities, new styles, and a new tourist industry. Tourism especially made Los Angeles the new American city. It's where the energy of the Jazz Age, the rise of immigration, the dynamic split of Christianity, the rise of new gender expectations, and the flash of the film industry all converged to attract America's obsession. And so Los Angeles became the place where Aimee Semple McPherson believed that her Pentecostal Christianity could meet the people where they were. So with $5,000, Aimee found a construction firm willing to work with gradually raised money and began constructing the Angelus Temple in Echo Park, Los Angeles. It was finished in 1923, and by raising to over $250,000, she made it into one of America's first true megachurches. As said before, it could seat 5,300 people in its gaudy sanctuary, and membership grew to 10,000 in the first 7 years. In that time, 40 million people, most of them tourists, had come to worship at the Angelus Temple, and the majority of her congregation members were women. How did she attract so many people? According to Edith Blumhofer, it was her mix of piety, patriotism, and pageantry that spoke a simple gospel message in the language of the ordinary person. Specifically, this was the language of movies. Her sermons used Hollywood staging to create spectacular illustrations that stayed in people's minds more than words ever could. One of her most famous sermons was Arrested for Speeding, where she dressed in a traffic cop's uniform, rode onto stage atop a police motorcycle, sirens blaring, and shouted, "Stop! You're speeding to hell!" Another sermon saw her fight Satan in a boxing ring before knocking him out with Jesus. Heavenly Aeroplane brought a biplane into the temple, with the illustration being that the devil was the pilot and temptation was the propeller. Interestingly enough, that idea came from a failed attempt to preach from the back of an aeroplane. It's worth mentioning here that many stories of her sermon illustrations are based on conflicting reports and memories, so the specifics of what happened during these sermons are unclear. But what is clear is that her preaching left an impression on people similar to that of what watching a movie felt like. From pictures and records, we know that she frequently bought costumes from Hollywood to dress up her sermon illustrations and retellings of biblical stories to capture the attention of her congregation with lavish, glamorous productions. She used modern staging techniques, costuming, lighting, actors from the area, and cinematography to craft professional performances that made people feel like they were in the theater. And from this massive spectacle, she was able to repeatedly drive home her simple Foursquare gospel, focused on immediate life-changing salvation, spirit baptism, divine healing through faith and prayer, and the premillennial return of Christ. Gotta love that premillennialism. Or not. Her innovation was not theological complexity, but reducing her message to 4 bullet points and communicating them through the means of the film industry for a media-hungry generation. But Aimee also preached a social gospel. For one, she rejected the separation of faith and politics and called upon all presidents and political leaders to conform to the Christian values of Jesus Christ. Her social gospel ended up aligning with the progressive welfare politics of the time, and she lent FDR's New Deal her theological support, which really helped it. She founded and funded a number of social programs in Los Angeles through the Angelus Temple, and she used the funds that she raised to support churches of all denominations. Despite her rejection by Lutheranism, there are a number of Lutheran churches whose buildings were built or rebuilt by the money that she raised. She tried to bridge racial tensions by preaching to both sides of the white supremacist divide. She circulated reports that Ku Klux Klan members would attend her services, but then leave their robes behind afterwards, their faith no longer being compatible with their practice. Though in other cases, she appealed to the Christian nationalism of the Klan in her sermons, which is very not great. She held integrated meetings from the beginning and believed that black and white people alike belonged in the Angelus Temple. She also invited a diverse array of black men to preach at the Angelus Temple, both conservative and progressive, though not women. And while the majority of her congregations were made up of women, it's important to recognize that she saw herself as the exception, not the rule. She did not see herself as beginning a new movement of women preachers, but as a woman uniquely called by the Spirit to this ministry. But women formed a core part of the leadership of the Angelus Temple, which was big for the time. And in other writings, Aimee expressed that women preaching was a sign of the end times that should be welcomed by all Christians. In a bizarre story from 1926, Aimee suddenly went missing and then wound up in a Mexican desert. She claimed that she had been kidnapped by Mexican criminals, which isn't great, and neither were her descriptions. The court agreed and refused her attempts to press charges. The media frenzy made it out to be a sex scandal since she was reportedly seen near a Mexican resort with one of her temple producers. Plenty of Christian leaders saw this as reason to discount her once and for all, but her supporters rallied to her defense. The district attorney of Los Angeles tried to countersue her for lying to the court, but also didn't have any evidence, and ultimately the court decided that this was all a big waste of time. For a while, it seemed like her influence and image were ruined by this event, but she recovered by merging her gospel message with American nationalism. She began to preach openly against the sins of evolution for corrupting schools, universities, and the government, and claimed that America needed to stay true to its Christian roots to survive the evils of modern atheism. Around this time, she began adopting the new woman image in her public appearances, leading to a number of her followers expressing disgust. But she defended herself by explaining that this embodiment of a new gender presentation would allow her to influence the influencers of society. As Matthew Sutton writes, there was no method that she wasn't willing to use to blend her old-time religion with nationalistic messages through performance spectacles to challenge a secular audience. The March of the Monarchs, from the opening of this video, was the culmination of her message to America. The Bible speaks a present message to our times, and it's up to you to claim Jesus as your Lord and Savior, lest the last Christian nation become overwhelmed by the rising forces of fascism and communism. From the Great Depression to the New Deal era through World War II, her Christian nationalism conveyed through weekly film production quality sermons propelled millions of followers to believe that the most heroic thing they could do was to claim America and thereby the world for Christ. Aimee died suddenly in 1944, leaving the foundations for a new brand of American Christian nationalism and breaking open the stage for a new kind of preacher who used spectacle, performance, and even sexuality to reach a people starved for spirituality. So if nothing else, Aimee Semple McPherson is a marvelously complicated person. But as much as I detest some of the things that she created, I can't help but relate to her in other ways. For one thing, I also look out to America and see a people starved for a spiritual message that speaks to them through their language. Overcoming the barriers of patriarchy and sexism by adopting the production strategies of Hollywood to preach a message that people can't help but listen to was absolutely brilliant. And I can see myself creating a March of the Monarchs type sermon with some major theological adjustments to reach people concerned about American imperialism. She recognized that people were bored by the old methods of Christianity and that her gospel witness would never be heard if she used the old methods. And in those two obstacles, she saw an opportunity to use her identity and talents to create an entirely new form of Christianity that preached a flamboyant and bold gospel message that perfectly tapped into the pulse of people abandoned by the church. As a queer person entering into ministry, I too see a number of my peers abandoned by the church who need a new expression of the gospel to discover how Christ's message is essential to their vocations. Perhaps the path forward is by integrating Aimee's spectacle with my theological substance. Because it's important to acknowledge that Aimee's prioritization of spectacle and style over substance led to the development and perpetuation of some really harmful theologies. If nothing else, her focus on premillennialism and instant healing and salvation created an in versus out or saved versus unsaved dichotomy, both within and outside of her following, that continues to harm many marginalized people, or even just those who experience doubt within the church to this day. That theology is certainly not unique to her, but she gave it the mass media techniques it needed to take root and thrive in America. Her merging of Christianity and American nationalism has also been fairly disastrous, as the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol reminds us. She's responsible for a lot of the polarization that we see within America and in Christianity. Her emphasis on America as a Christian nation blended single-minded patriotism with the Gospels in a way that dilutes their message of social justice and makes Christ into a proponent of American exceptionalism. And yet, her legacy is also one of breaking down doors for women and marginalized folks to preach a message to the powers that be by working outside the system rather than from within it. While Aimee is certainly no paragon of the women's rights movement, she did emphasize the trust in the spirit for her calling to preach and minister over any institution or system. Many queer people, as well as many people of color and women to this day, have drawn upon a similar trust in the Spirit when systems fail to recognize their gifts. Of course, such independence comes with great risk, such as lack of accountability and vulnerability to scandal, as Aimee Semple McPherson absolutely experienced throughout her life and career. And yet, if she hadn't been determined to preach on her own terms, she likely would not have redefined preaching as a multimedia effort in the way that she did. So while she's more of a trailblazer than a social movement saint, her decision to trust in the Spirit to follow her unique call provides a legacy for many marginalized people to follow. To trust in the Spirit's power to call them because of their uniqueness and offer their witness loudly and proudly to the world, even if the church at large rejects you at the time. This model doubtless comes with its challenges, but it cannot be overstated how Aimee's preaching through all forms of media reached a number of people who were dissatisfied with the church as it was and were drawn to the vision of what the church could be. So the legacy of Aimee Semple McPherson is conflicting. On one hand, she is responsible for raising a fundamentalist, nationalistic gospel to new life through the techniques of Hollywood mass media that has both made people feel liberated from sin and has contributed to polarization and oppression. Her priority of spectacle over substance and inspiration over institution allowed her to preach a vibrant gospel message at the expense of sacrificing accountability and community. The Christian church in America has been wrestling over whether this sacrifice is worth it to this day. As Matthew Sutton says, her use of technology made a simple message seem radical and relevant again. Her legacy asks us what the role of spectacle is in the proclamation of liberation and justice in a thoroughly unjust society. For Aimee perceived that America and Americans were not as Christian as they ought to be, and made great strides in solving that problem by adopting the language of her time to make the world listen to her message with flamboyant performance and attention-grabbing artistry. And while I absolutely disagree with her message, I do believe that we need preachers, especially those who come from marginalized spaces, who speak God's truth to the powers of today with a mix of authenticity and performance that will make a nation take notice. By revealing that millions of Americans had no trouble whatsoever listening to a woman preach, and in many ways preferred hearing a woman preach a message that felt entirely new, Aimee Semple McPherson figured out how to blend tradition and revolution. And though she'd likely disapprove, I believe that this is where the modern queer and feminist and even BIPOC Christian liberation movements can find palpable inspiration to trust in their call to use their unique methods of expression to create a substantial spectacle that will call the church into a new interpretation of the gospel that our world desperately needs. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next video.